There's many car myths that people have today about owning their vehicle. They believe they're doing the right thing for safety, for practicality, for durability of the vehicle, or longevity. But sadly, there's many cases where many of these myths are unfounded. So let's get into this. And the first one, a lot of people think that old cars are simply safer than new cars. New cars often are built of lighter materials. Sometimes they feel hollow. Many of them are built of aluminum now, where the good old-fashioned cars were built of heavy steel. You tap on them, they're hard. They have the big chrome bumpers, big solid steel type hoods, and a lot of the old vehicles just felt really heavy. So it's natural that a lot of people assume that the older vehicles are safer than the new vehicles that are built lightweight, full of plastics and composites and aluminum, and they just feel hollow. You couldn't be further from the truth. Now, everybody loves a good old-fashioned hot rod, everybody loves an old classic, and everybody loves that old reliable truck that just keeps going on. And there's nothing wrong with driving those. If they run, keep using them. One of the main reasons these older vehicles are not as safe, they don't have as many of the safety systems on board. They won't have typically airbags, and if they do have airbags, they're probably earlier generation of airbags. Some of them were even in some cases more dangerous than the collision itself. And sometimes a lot of these modern vehicles have far more airbags. They have softer inflating airbags, quicker response. They almost anticipate the collision. They have airbags that are maybe on the A-pillars, and of course curtain airbags and the doors. And they have a lot of them more premium versions may have 9, 12, 15, 18 airbags on board, where a lot of the old vehicles might only have 2. You might only have a couple of front-facing airbags. So even from a safety perspective, the older vehicles often just don't have the protective equipment on board. They don't have collision avoidance systems, lane departure systems, which all help avoid some of the accidents in the first place. What we're really talking about is a vehicle that's safer in the event of a collision. Unfortunately, God forbid that anybody is actually in that situation. The fact is, older vehicles are not as safe. And largely because they're meant to just absolutely get rocked. You'd hit something, you'd run into a tree, or you'd have a collision and you'd basically dust it off, and you think, hey, look at that. I don't even need to take that to the body shop. There's barely a scuff on it. That was at a 50-kilometer-an-hour collision, and you barely put a mark on that old truck. Well, that sounds impressive. But the problem with that is if you're driving 30, 40, 50 and you hit something, that energy goes from here to here, quick, fast, and in a hurry. So that energy now is transferred. If it's not transferred through the vehicle, it's transferred to you, the occupants. Usually means you're flying forward, you're hitting the steering wheel, you're hitting the dash, you're hitting all kinds of hard things. Usually you get way more hurt in an old vehicle. And the old vehicle may not crumple at all. The old vehicle just, in some cases, bounces off something. They're clearly meant to support themselves. The old vehicles will help themselves from catastrophically imploding. But that's not what we want. And with collision testing over and over in the last number of years, car manufacturers are finding new ways to improve on their safety margins. So what they're creating is crumple zones. You see a lot of cutouts in hoods. You'll go underneath the hood of the vehicles. You'll see they're contoured in certain ways. They'll have cutouts. They'll have slots. And you'll see that in certain areas, a lot of times in fenders, hoods, and all over through the vehicle. They're built like that. They're actually built to absorb that energy, take that energy up. So if you are in a collision, even at a relatively low speed, sometimes it doesn't take much to write off a modern day vehicle. We hear that all the time. Boy, it doesn't take much to write off a new vehicle these days, does it? No, the fact is it doesn't. Well, for a couple of reasons. Parts are expensive, lots of sensors, expensive parts. Yes, that's all very expensive to replace. But they also will crumple very easily, whereas the older vehicles simply wouldn't. So where it might save you money in the body shop driving an older vehicle, you want to save yourself, don't you? Do you want to save yourself, maybe your family, your friends, whoever's riding on board? I'd rather save the people, because you can always buy a new car, but you can't buy a new life. These new vehicles simply avoid accidents better, detect accidents better, have better airbags, have better systems on board inside in the event of an accident, and the vehicles themselves are meant to absorb all of that and cushion that impact. So instead of going from 50 down to nothing, it's like 50, 40, 30, 20, but it does it over a course of a second or two. And so a lot of that energy now is actually absorbed like an accordion. Think of an accordion. Remember, you know, the old music instrument? I was more of a trumpet player myself. But really the facts are, old vehicles simply are not as safe as the new ones. And while you may believe that because they're bigger and heavier and built of heavy materials, yeah, the vehicle will last, but it's going to be harder on you as the occupant. So I'd much rather have a modern vehicle that's more well engineered and well designed to protect the people inside.
Life's too short to drive boring cars.
Now, another myth that we see today, and we hear about it all the time, and some of those old school mechanics even still continuously advertise that to these days. You're doing an oil change on your vehicle. You have your canister style oil filter. A lot of these vehicles are mounted upside down, but a lot of them are on the side. Some of them are upside down. Some people believe that filling that oil filter up with oil before you put it into the vehicle is actually what you need to do, with the idea that you're actually not having any dry spots throughout the engine. I mean, nobody wants to run their engine dry after doing an oil change, and we all know that quite often it's those dry starts that are hard on a vehicle when there's no oil in the system. It's obvious. A lot of people believe that filling this up gets oil into places right away before you even need to start the vehicle, so that you're eliminating or reducing the amount of dry start action that you're putting onto the vehicle. But that couldn't actually be further from the truth. There's a couple of good reasons why you don't actually need to pre-fill your oil filter. A lot of these other newer style vehicles actually have the insert, the drop-in insert, and it's just an external canister with a lid. You don't really fill those up either, because as soon as you pour the oil in, there's usually an oil tube that goes out to the engine. It'll just drain right through. So really, filling that up does no good anyhow. But these old canister style, the only thing you want to do is put oil around this. There's always that oil rim, this filter rim, the seal right here. You definitely want to lubricate that with some fresh oil. So put your finger in the oil, put it on here, make sure that's well lubricated so that it turns easily, so that when you're threading this on, it actually slides on very easily, and you're not having to over torque it, because if you tear that rubber, then you're going to have a leak and you're going to have a big problem. There's actually a major downside, is putting this oil, you're assuming this oil's clean. Now maybe this unfiltered oil has been sitting on your shelf for a while. Maybe it's only half full. Maybe you're using what's left of this, or maybe you have a 5-liter jug. Maybe it's partially opened. How do you know some flies or debris? Sometimes it gets dusty, you get a little bit of sand. How do you know that oil is perfected? Because if you're pouring it in the filter, you may be actually introducing some contaminated oil. Now, some argue that, what if you pour it down into the case? You're doing that anyway. You're putting the same oil down into the case of the engine through the top filler. Well, the fact is, as it pulls, it goes to the pump and it goes immediately through the filter. So it's not spending a lot of time in the engine. Rather, as soon as it's in the bottom of that case, it's pulled through the oil pump and right through the filter, which of course eliminates any of those contaminants almost pretty much right away before it goes through all of those small little lubricating orifices or goes up into the rings of your engine. So realistically, you run a big risk of actually putting contaminants in the oil of your vehicle if you're planning to put that right into the filter. There's another aspect, is a lot of these are the canister drop-in style, where it's just a pleated filter and you just take the top off. Well, you can't fill those up anyway, so what do you do there? So that argument is gone. Not to mention, the oil pumps today are 10 times better than the oil pumps of yesterday. They're pumps that come up with extremely aggressive rates. They can pressurize the system extremely quickly. And realistically, there's a lot of systems on board that need oil and need that lubrication. That's why these pumps are such high duty factor these days. I mean, there's some car brands out there that now are moving into a belt-driven oil pump, and I personally believe that's a catastrophic waiting to happen. However, most vehicles still use a set of gears that push that oil through the system. But these new pumps are much more aggressive because they have to be. They're feeding not just the lubrication to the engine, they're feeding as well other systems like the variable valve timing systems. They're feeding VVTIs, variable lift systems, and a lot of other components within there. Turbochargers quite often now are using that same oil feed. So we have a lot more systems on board in modern day vehicles than we ever did before. It just used to be just a standard lubricating pump just to send oil to the uppers of the engine. It wasn't needed for anything else. But now these pumps have to be upgraded to provide high pressure oil, direct oiling, and quickly to a lot of these other elements, these other components within these engines. So now you actually have a pump that's very quick, combined with the fact that most engine oils these days are synthetic. Synthetic oil is extremely light, extremely thin, and it'll get right to its source very quickly. Pretty much virtually as fast as you turn the engine on, As a matter of fact, even the cranking motion of the engine is turning the oil pump in most cases, in which case it's already lubricating the engine before it even starts hard. So yes, between having oil, the better grade of oil these days, obviously with synthetics, higher pressure outpump of these pumps, and naturally the fact that you risk contaminating your oil by pouring it directly into the filter, it's just there's no need to pre-fill your filter. Not to mention, you fill this up, what if it's one of those vehicles that actually have to put it downwards? We had this boat years ago that actually had a mount with the same kind of filter as this, and you had to put it down and thread it on. Well, as soon as you fill that up, you're dumping oil. So it's really no point. Save yourselves the money, the aggravation, and ultimately the potential for failure. And don't worry about it. The oil pump's picking up the slack. If you find the content relatable and useful, be sure to hit that subscribe button and as well that little notifications bell. It'll let you know when the next great video is up. Another huge myth that a lot of people have is, should I throw my automatic transmission into neutral when I'm sitting at a long light? Well, when you consider the fact that you don't even start to see wear and tear on a vehicle unless you had it in, sitting in a gear for 10, 15, 20 minutes, that's going to create a little extra heat. The fact remains is sitting at a light for 2 to 3 minutes, which is pretty much the nationwide average, you're likely not going to subject the vehicle to any further heat damage. Realistically, the vehicle's not going to heat enough. The transmission's not going to heat up enough. You might be talking about double digits, just small double digits of temperature increases over the course of 2 or 3, 4 minutes. It's not enough to cause any kind of problem, and it's well within the range, the rating of that vehicle. Now, there's 2 types of exceptions: double clutch gearbox, single clutch gearbox, and manual gearboxes. If you drive a manual, a 3-pedal car with a clutch and a gear shift lever that runs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, for example, you're definitely going to want to throw that in neutral, because holding that into gear, you have to, first of all, have the clutch in, or you have to put it in neutral, because sitting at the light, you're going to roll up in second first, and obviously you have to put the clutch in or it's going to stall. So in doing so, you're going to have to throw it in neutral. You have no point. And definitely better than putting and holding the clutch in with it in gear, because now you're wearing on the throwout bearing and you're going to induce extra preliminary wearing on that vehicle. So you don't want to do that. As well, single automated gearboxes. This car here has what they have, one of those older roboticized gearboxes, some of the older Lambos, some of the older Ferraris. They have essentially a manual, but with the paddle shifter. Some of the early generations actually used a manual gearbox with a series of actuations that would actually shift the vehicle. So that there too, you're going to have to pull it, double gears, usually typically like that, pull up on the paddle shifters, throw them in neutral. Because that as well, sitting there is going to be sitting there chewing away at the throwout bearing, because the vehicle's brain is telling it to throw it in neutral, but it's actually essentially holding a clutch in at an electronic level. That's bad news. That's wear and tear. But for 98% of the vehicles on the road that we see today that run a regular automatic torque converter transmission, 8, 9 speed, 10 speed automatic transmissions, you definitely want to leave it in gear. And there's a major reason for it. Because if every light you stop, you're putting it in neutral. As soon as you put it back in drive, there's a clunk. A lot of older vehicles, the U-joints. Have you ever had an older vehicle and you're backing it up, and then you go put it in drive, and then there's that clunk, and then it goes? Well, every time you go from neutral or from one other gear back to the opposite gear, say from reverse to forward, forward to reverse, neutral to drive, neutral to reverse, you're going to impose extra jarring motion on the chassis. That's motor mounts, transmission mounts, U-joints. That takes a big hit. Your differentials, your transmission. Every time you're doing that, you clunk, it catches, it bangs, it hits. So if you're doing that 10, 15, 20 times throughout a trip across the city, every time you do that in the course of a year, you might actually create some permanent damage to that automatic transmission. So throwing it in neutral really has no benefit. The amount of heating you're seeing in that vehicle while you sit there for 2 minutes is not enough. It's negligible. But rather, that constant putting it back into gear from neutral creates a whole host of new problems and may impose premature failure on anything from mounts to transmission differentials, you name it, U-joints at the very least, could be parts that you might be changing in the near future. Another myth a lot of people come across, they believe finding that gem, that barn find, that old vehicle that little old lady only drove on Sundays, and then her Husband passed away, and now that vehicle, she's trying to sell it, but she hasn't driven it in like 14 years, and it hasn't had any servicing since, but it's only got, 8,000 original miles, and it's a 22-year-old vehicle. You think you found a true gem, and there's a good possibility you have. But buying an old vehicle or a vehicle with extremely or extraordinarily low miles, like way outside the norm, is not good. In many cases, that vehicle is much worse to find than a regular vehicle that has regular miles, standard, 5 to 10,000 miles every year is kind of an average area. You definitely, as soon as you're at the 15 to 20,000, now you're on the higher end of the spectrum. But even a vehicle that you find with 4,000 miles driven every year, but consistently, and it's been maintained, oil changes every single year, servicing every single year, that's where you want to be. That's the type of vehicle. Because finding a vehicle that's older, that maybe hasn't had servicing for years and has just sat, lots of problems. First of all, let me explain, old engine oil sits in there. Now, oil generally doesn't go bad. However, because it's housed in this cocoon of aluminum or steel, it usually sits in there, and the hot and the cold and the hot and the cold over season after season creates these temperature differentials, and sometimes it builds condensation, oxidization, humidity inside the engine as you have dew points, and then ultimately you wind up with corrosion inside. You wind up with water and moisture in the engine, in the oil, sometimes in the fuel, and then that corrodes fuel lines. Brake lines, same thing. You have water in the brake lines. That starts to break down those, and they can start to rot away on you. The vehicle can literally rot away right before your very eyes. I personally knew somebody who had a Pontiac Grand Prix GTP. He believed it was the second best thing since sliced bread. Well, he drove this car a little bit in the beginning, and then he basically parked it. He just kept it all looking nice, polished it constantly, but never bothered to drive it, never put any miles on it. Unfortunately, 15 years later, he wanted to put it back on the road and had all kinds of problems. It was starting to use oil. The brakes needed work, realizing brake lines were rotted out. He had a lot of money he actually had to put into that vehicle, and also didn't realize the bottom of the chassis was starting to rot out. So a vehicle that sits is usually more what I call neglected. You also get, seals that start to leak, whether it's, you're talking about the pan gaskets or any kind of gaskets in the engine. Sometimes they dry out, especially in some of the older vehicles. Some of the newer technology is better now, but some of the older vehicles, they'll tend to rot out. They'll start to dry. They'll start to leak. And now all of a sudden you have a vehicle that maybe won't shift. The transmission won't shift well. You have leaks. You have oil leaks. The engine starts to get oily. That's because it hasn't been used. An engine that's run regularly, oil pumps running, brake lines are operated, you're changing the fluids on everything. That's the vehicle to buy. And something with extraordinarily low mileage is likely going to cost you a lot of money. I mean, it could be a true gem, but if you're going to buy one, you want to go from top to bottom, inspect it underneath, make sure you're looking free of corrosion, do a proper brake flush, transmission fluid change, engine flush, every flush filter change you could possibly imagine. Not to mention a vehicle that sits that long couldn't even have rodent infestation. I've seen mice get in air boxes, get in wiring, chew everything apart, and create a vehicle that's a real problem, simply because it sits. Mice know too if nobody's home. They come knocking and nobody's answering, they're going to make that their home. Another myth people often have is your alternator will charge your battery. If you drive a car that sits around a lot, maybe don't use it a ton, maybe the battery's weak, maybe it's failed a battery load test. There's a bunch of reasons that might give you indication why that vehicle's not going to run or charge on the next one, or maybe it cranks but barely runs and it starts and you're like, yeah, that's good, I'll just throw some jumper cables in the back. That's one of the worst things you can do, because some of the older vehicles could tolerate that a little bit more. But the new vehicles now are much more sensitive. They don't have what they call like a generator. They don't truly overcharge the battery. Really, the charge comes now from the health of the battery in general. But unfortunately, what a lot of people do now is overload their alternators. They know they have weak batteries and they continue to run them. But a weak battery run on a system with modern day technology, with a lot of these vehicles have a lot of new electronics, new technology, new lighting systems, power features, power locks, power doors, power everything, heated elements, components throughout. I mean, you look at the modern day vehicle, it has every bell and whistle you can possibly imagine, you can even dream of 15 or 20 years ago, now are loading up that electrical system. And a lot of people believe, well, I've got a weak battery, it barely started, but we're good to go. That weak battery is not going to be recharged properly by the alternator, because the modern day alternators in modern cars are meant more of a maintain mode. They're not so much get it up to speed and hold it and overcharge it till the cows come home. It's really there just essentially to maintain the charge. Ultimately, you want to have a healthy state of charge on your battery. And then when you start the vehicle, all the electronics work, because all the electronics need that very finite voltage range, has to range at that very specific, 13 and a half volts in that range. If you start dipping down into the mid 12s, low 12s, there's a good chance some of the electronics are going to start flaking out on you. It might even spit out some service or check engine lights. I've personally seen that. All of a sudden you have weird codes and gremlins. A lot of times it just strictly comes down to a weaker battery. Make sure you got a good battery in a good state of charge. If you don't use the vehicle much, but maybe the battery's not that old and you think you can still bring it back, you want to definitely use something like a charger or a maintainer. If the vehicle sits a lot, maybe it's a summer toy, put on a battery maintainer. A vehicle battery charger that sits and you just leave it on there and it charges up as much as it needs to, usually about an amp at a time or a couple of amps. It charges and then it cuts off, and then it detects when the battery drops, and then it continues and recharges. So putting on a battery maintainer on a vehicle that sits a lot is the best way to minimize the impact of having a weak battery. On top of that, if you really need to get to where you got to go, sure, if you've got to boost your car, you've got to throw a quick charge to it to get it going. I get it. But long term, that likely will cause more problems. And it's not uncommon to actually have to change a battery and shortly thereafter find out that you have to change an alternator. That's probably you put too much load and too much burden on that modern alternator with that weak battery. So you don't want to do that. Save yourself some money. Definitely make sure your battery's in good state of charge. Keep it on a charger or drive the vehicle regularly. When you do notice some problems with slow cranking, weakness, you get some weird codes that might be related to random electrical failures, that might be all indications that your battery might be a little weak. Do a load test on it. If the load test reveals that it failed, change it right away. Ultimately, that's going to save you dollars in the end. Hope that helped dispelling those myths. As well, check out how to maintain your vehicle to keep it running forever, and write down there more great maintenance tips. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you all real soon, everybody. Bye-bye.